about exceptions in Java. So exceptions are common problems that we face in real world scenarios. For example, we too face the exceptions. So if we are going from home to school or college or office, you would face a number of problems. If suppose that's a rainy season, then rain would cause some problems. And if you are traveling by bike, then bike could cause some problems. Either tire would be flattened like that. So problems are very common in our day-to-day life. Similarly, exceptions are very common in programming language. So exceptions are called problems which occurs during the execution of a program. So these are the three reasons for exceptions, three common reasons for exceptions: invalid data, file not found, out of memory. So these are the very common reasons for exceptions. For example, if you are trying to fill the some form, in the phone number field, if you are entering the email address, then that's called invalid data. That's one kind of exception reason. And another one is file not found exception. File not found means if you are trying to read a file or write a file, but the file actually doesn't exist, then that would cause some file not found exceptions. And out of memory. Out of memory means if you are running a program, that program needs some amount of memory, but that amount of memory it's not allocated to JVM, then that would cause out of memory exceptions. So these are the three common reasons for exceptions. There are n number of reasons. These are the three most commonly caused reasons. And then there are three types of exceptions. The first one is checked exception, second unchecked exceptions, and third one is errors. Checked exception means compile time exceptions, so which is pre-known. For example, if you're writing some fragment of code, the compiler tells that this fragment of code would cause some exceptions, so you should handle that exception in a better manner. That is called compile time exceptions. So we can relate this with a real-time scenario. For example, if you are going from home to your college or office, if it's a rainy season, then you know that you should take umbrella or raincoat for managing if rain has come. So here we are trying to overcome that exception, which is called compiled exception. We know before the exception actually occurs, so that is called compile time exception, checked by the compiler at compile time. So if your fragment of code has some problems, then compiler will tell that this fragment of code would cause some problems, so please try to handle those problems like that. And then second one is unchecked exception. Unchecked exception means runtime exceptions. So here this is very opposite to this, is very different from compile time exceptions. You don't know before the problem occurs, which is called runtime exceptions, so which occurs at only during the runtime. So for example, if you are going from home to office by bike, if your bike tire has got punctured, then it is called runtime exception, runtime problem. You will handle that problem by using some alternative ways. That is called runtime exception. Similarly, in programming language, especially in Java, runtime exceptions are very common. For example, if you have created the array size called 3, and if you're trying to add the element at the 5th index, then it would cause the array index out of bound exception. So this is the second type of exception. And the third type is errors. So these are the problems beyond the control of the programmers. So for example, stack overflow is one of those problems. We will try to analyze more about exceptions in the upcoming videos. Thanks for now. Now we are going to discuss about the exception methods. So these are the 4 methods that are widely used by the developers to debug the reason for exception. The first method is public string get message. So by calling this method, this method would return the detailed message about the exception. So suppose if some exception is getting occurred, then it will try to return the detailed message about the exception. So using that message, you can either debug the problem or you can analyze the exception in a further manner. And the second method is public string get cause. This method would return the actual cause for the exception. If suppose if you are trying to add an element at the 5th index, but the actual array size is 3, means then array index out of bound exception would be thrown. So at that point, it will try to expose the it will try to explain the cause for the exception. This would be very useful for debugging purposes. And the third method is public string get string. This method would return the actual class name with the message. So actual class where this exception is getting occurred and with the message. And the fourth method is public void print stack trace. This method would print the complete details about the exception. So where this exception has occurred, the method name and the line number, and then the method where it has been called, like that it will print the complete stack trace about the exception. So these are the 4 methods that are commonly used by the developers for debugging the exception. If suppose if you want to debug your exception, you can also use these methods for further debugging. Thanks for watching. It's about try catch. So when to use try catch syntax in our code. So try. So what do you mean by try in real life? So if suppose if you want to try, if you want to do something, then you can put the thing inside the try. If suppose that thing is causing some problems at the runtime, then that should be handled in catch. So that's a basic thing. So here, if suppose if you are writing some exception prone code, then that should be written within try block, and that exception handling part should be run in catch block. So that is called try catch. So this is called try block and this is called catch block. So this try and catch are keywords. You should type all the characters in this small case letters only. So in the inside the try block, what we have done is we have created a test array, test of 2. So it would have created test array with size 2. So 0th index, 1st index. So you can insert values only in 0th index and 1st index. If suppose if you are trying to access the index other than 1, 2, 3, sorry 0 and 1. If suppose if you are trying to access the index 4, then that would throw some exception. So in this case, we have created test of 2 into 2. So the array size would be only 2. You could access only 0th index and 1st index. You don't have the access of permission or feasibility to access other indexes. In the second line, what we have done is we are trying to access the 4th index. So 4. So it would try to throw some exception. That exception should be handled by someone. That handling person is called catch block. So that thrown exception will be handled inside this catch block. Here we are trying to print the stack trace. So e.print stack trace would print the actual reasons and actual causes for the exception, and it also print the various things. So if suppose if you are trying to run this program, you could see the following output. So Java lang dot exception has been thrown. Java lang dot array dot Java dot lang array index out of bound exception 4. 4 means you are trying to access index 4, but the index is actually not present. And it will also project the line at which this exception has been occurred. So at test dot try catch demo dot main try catch demo line number 19. So this is line number. So it will be very useful for debugging purposes when an exception has occurred. So these are the scenarios why we need to use try catch block in our code. If suppose if you're writing some exception prone code, then it would be better if you write the code inside the try block and try to handle those exceptions in a proper manner. The finally block usage and importance, and where we need to use finally block. So here I have written some sample code where I will try to explain how finally block help us to do some operations. So this is the first block, which is try block. If suppose if the try block is causing some exception, some problem, then that catch block would be executed. So if suppose if there are some statements that need to be executed even if the exception
occurs or the even exception doesn't occur, then that should be written inside the finally block. So consider a scenario. If suppose if you are trying to write some data to a file, if there's some exception occurs, then catch block would be used to handle that exception. So even if the exception occurs or not, that doesn't matter. We should close the file before terminating the program. So in such a scenario, the final block would be very useful. So generally, whenever if you're trying to execute some set of statements, even if the exception occurs or not, that doesn't matter, then you should write that code inside the finally block. In this case, what I have done is inside the try block, I have written a code that would throw an exception called arithmetic exception, because a equal to 1 by 0. So this will try to throw an arithmetic exception if I run this program. So this catch block would be executed, which is ex would be printed, and then java.lang arithmetic exception divided by 0 would be thrown, and then finally block, which is present inside the finally block code, would be printed. If suppose if I comment this code, then the exception wouldn't be occurred, because there is no code inside the try block. In such a scenario, catch block won't be executed, whereas finally block would be executed, which is finally block is printed here. So please try to include finally block whenever you need to execute some set of statements, even if the exception occurs or not. So that's the case where we need to use finally block. Discuss about multiple catch block using this sample program. So after this video, you would have learned about when to use catch block and how to use catch block and other things in a detailed manner. So here, multiple catch. If your code has a scenario that would cause multiple exceptions in the fragment, then it would be better if you use multiple catch block instead of writing a single catch for handling the exception in a better manner. So here what we have done is we have written some code and I have commented those code. So here two catch block. Here the first catch block would handle array index out of bounds exception, and the second catch block would handle exception. So it can be any exception. So these are the two catch blocks. If your code, which your protector code, throws some exception, so it will try to check whether the first catch block type and the thrown type are similar. If the thrown exception type and the catch block type are similar, then this catch block would be executed. If not, the second catch block would be checked. So it will go to the n number of catch blocks. If the first catch block is getting executed, then it will try to skip the other remaining catch block. So that's the flow. So in this code, I am trying to remove the comments for the first fragment of code. So I have removed the comments for the first fragment of code. In this code, what I have done is I have tried to create the test array of size 2 and I am trying to access the index 4. So it will try to throw array index out of bound exception. We will see how we have handled that exception in this catch block. So here this code is throwing array index out of bound exception. So that exception has been handled by using this catch block. So catch array index out of bound exception E1. So we are trying to print exception 1 ex1 here for some display purpose ex1, and then we are trying to use the print stack trace for printing the complete stack details for better debugging purposes. So here we have print this stack trace java.lang.array index out of bound exception. 4 means we are trying to access the index 4, but the index 4 isn't present inside this array, and then it will try to show the line at which the exception has been occurred. So line number 19 where the exception has occurred. So this is the first scenario. If I am trying to comment this code, and then I am trying to uncomment this code, second fragment of code. So here, if I run this code for the second time, I would get this following exception: java.lang.arithmetic exception divided by 0. The reason behind that is, here we are trying to divide the value 1 by 0, so it will try to cause the arithmetic exception. So that exception, it will try to check whether that exception type is similar to this first catch block exception type. So the exception thrown is arithmetic exception, but the exception handled by the first catch block is array index out of bound exception. So this block won't be executed. It will try to check the second exception block, second catch block. In the second catch block, the exception type handled was exception. So this class is the parent of all the exception classes. So it can be arithmetic exception, or it can be array index out of bound exception. It can be any exception. Exception class is the parent of all the exception classes. That's why this code is getting executed, ex2 and then the stack trace. So the line at which the exception has been occurred is line number 21. So this is a sample code to explain multiple catch blocks.